What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, Mtg here with the Love Machine. Talk a little Magic with you because there's big news. In case you haven't heard, in case somehow you haven't heard this, these madmen, these mad lads actually did it. They banned Omnath, everybody. We didn't think they were going to do it. None of us thought they were going to do it. They actually did it. They had the stones to ban Omnath. While the print is still fresh on the set, too. It hasn't been out that long. Omnath gone. But they've also banned Lucky Clover, which is, good call. As well as Escape to the Wilds, which was mostly good in Lucky Clover decks and Omnath decks and Omnath Clover decks. So, cool, I guess, fine. Whatever, sure. They banned that card, fine. But mostly, obviously, big deal, is that Omnath and Lucky Clover are gone. And I was going to make a video about, how I felt about the bans or whatever, but that video is going to be, 20 seconds long. I like them. I like the bans. It's good. Fresh standard. With mostly fair Magic cards. There's a couple of cards that I'll get to towards the beginning of the video that I'm still a little bit worried about their presence in Standard. But we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it as we move through. I actually owe the patrons a video about the top 10 sleepers in Standard, the top 10 cards to brew with right now. But since we got these bans, that list changed a little bit, slightly, so I'm going to hold that one off until a little bit later in the week, and today we're going to go super deep and talk about 15 different decks that you can play right now in Standard since the bans. Now, you are right, that is so much pasta. That's a lot of decks to talk about in one video, but for the first time in forever, Standard feels wide open. There are some problematic cards to talk about. We'll get to it in a second. But for the first time in a while, we can talk about more than just 2 or 3 decks at one time and not feel embarrassed. So I want to celebrate that. Plus, in the last couple of days since the bannings, I haven't really seen people put out too much content talking about all the different things we can do right now, or at least try to do. So I wanted to provide that source for you. Everybody else playing it real close to the chest right now, but I wanted to come out here and just talk about all the things we can be doing right now because I love you and I want you to have nice things. So let's get to it. Let's talk about a whole bunch of decks. It's actually more than 15. We'll probably get to 20 decks in this video somehow. But anyway, number 1, Public Enemy. Number 1, I want to go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room that I want to get out of the way is Mr. Cleve, the Ember Cleveland show. This card is still in Standard. They didn't ban this card. They probably should have. Because I think Embercleave is probably just the strongest card that remains in Standard at this moment. There's a lot you can do with it too. Not just mono red and not even just Gruul. Right? There's some things. I guess you could make Knights if you wanted to, which is low-key a good deck with really good mana right now. But one way or the other, Embercleave remains very likely the single strongest card in Standard. So get ready. You thought it was bad that your opponent played Omnath on 3 and did crazy stuff on 4 and finished the game on turn 6 or 7. Now they're just going to kill you on turn 4. So have fun experiencing that. I guess what I'm saying here is that if there's one card that didn't get banned, that is still likely in my mind to get banned at some point, it's probably Cleve. Card's been too strong the entire time, especially with the other stuff they put in Standard with the stupid things. So a lot of the games come down to if they have Embercleave, they win, and there's really not anything you can actually do about it. So I do think that Embercleave is a bit of a problem, but face facts, at this point, I think it's just the best card in Standard, and no matter how you build the deck, you got a pretty good deck. So remember that if you're not going to build Embercleave exists, so at least plan for it. Now, I think if there's another card, if there's 2 cards that remain in Standard that are likely to get banned at some point, the other one is kind of the polar opposite of Embercleave, because Embercleave is a really fast card that finishes games on turn 4, pretty reliably, but the other card I'm a little bit worried about is Eugene over here. The Spirit Dragon's still in Standard, and there's still ramp. There's still so much ramp. They got rid of Euro, but there's still plenty of ways to ramp into Ugin very quickly, and you don't even have to be playing mono green. Just ask the colorless players, because colorless Ugin is a real deck. It's a real deck, you guys. It's not just a meme or anything. That deck is actually very powerful, but mono green and Simic Ugin are still decks too, and Temur Ugin. There's a bunch of Ugin decks in the format, and even though it takes a lot longer to get to, and the mana cost makes it seem like a more fair Magic card, once it's down, the games are pretty much just as over as if your opponent had dropped an Embercleave on a Rotting Regisaur on turn 4. The game is done. Most scoops, I think 90% of scoops in the format right now are forced by an Ugin coming down way too early in the game. And I think that's going to continue happening. Might be a problem. So again, just playing against Ugin if you're not going to play with it, because this is the card that people not playing Embercleave are going to be trying to make work, I would imagine. But moving from 2 cards that are probably too good into a deck that people are at least really annoyed by. I wouldn't call this deck too good by any stretch, but I've already seen people like, oh, the format's going to be nothing but rogues for the next God knows how long, right? And it might be right. I think rogues is a pretty strong deck, and it's one that I'm really interested in seeing how it performs nowadays. That really two of the best decks in Standard have been completely neutered at this point. So I think rogues definitely has a chance. A lot of players in France for the Red Bull Untapped event a couple of weeks ago decided that rogues was going to be a potent contender. I think 40% of the field was rogues or something like that. Didn't do super well in that event, but it's probably a very viable deck now. That reminds me of some of the tempo decks we've seen recently, and even more concisely, it reminds me of the Fairies deck that was popular during Lorwyn Block. That I played an awful lot of and loved, but it's nowhere near as powerful as the Fairies deck was, but it's every bit as annoying to some players' mind. A lot of players just don't like playing against aggro tempo decks that counter their spells, remove their creatures, and get to play their guys at flash, at instant speed. People don't tend to like that unless they're playing with it. I understand why people are more or less infuriated at this point with the Rogues deck, and people are not happy with the likelihood of a Rogues meta, but I think that I think that Rogues is a fair deck at its heart, and I'm at least happy with the concept of the prospect of getting back to fair Magic, which I'll talk a little bit more about with the next entry. But I think that at its heart, Rogues is a much more fair deck than we've seen in present times in Standard, and I'm much more happy with the prospect of going up against Rogues at a 40% meta share than I am going up against Omnath at a 70% meta share. But if I'm going to talk about rogues, I should probably also talk about the Demir control deck, and really control as a concept, because I think there's 3 or 4 decks in this category, right? The Demir control deck, that's not really rogues, but like sometimes it plays a handful of rogues. Weird hybrids, but I'm talking specifically here about the almost completely instant speed Demir control deck that we see popping up here and there. This deck, I think, is even better. I know that it was meant to combat the Omnath decks, but oddly enough, now that Omnath is not a force in the format anymore, I think that deck could arguably get better, especially if it finds a way to force some main deck sweepers to take care of decks like Mono Red and Gruul that are sure to see a resurgence. If this deck gets a little bit better at taking out creatures within the main deck, I think that it's probably just still a contender in the format. But there's also decks like Jeskai and Azorius Control that I think are very good, especially if decks like Mono Red and Gruul do pick back up. We might see a resurgence in white being a premier color in control decks again, whether we see Jeskai, Azorius, or maybe even Esper, because white has the best sweeper in the format. Shadow of the Sky is 4 mana, and it's very, very good for the most part against Mono Red, especially when Mono Red doesn't get the perfect draw, but as we all know, Mono Red always gets the perfect draw, but you're still going to be looking for that shatter against those decks, and it's just the best sweeper right now. So as a tool to combat aggro, I could see white being more in vogue in control decks. So Jeskai, Esper, Azorius, these are all real considerations, but right now black has the best removal in the format, so Demir has been the control deck of the moment, and I could see that continuing going forward too. Either way, a control deck could be important in the new meta, and most healthy metas do include a control deck, so I wouldn't begrudge that. But I do want to talk briefly here about a deck that I think is also still very good, maybe even better than ever at this point, because not only does it combat the control decks that are sure to be a force in the meta, but even more importantly, it combats very well, you could even say completely kneecaps, the rogues decks. If you're looking for a deck that beats rogues, you don't like a rogues meta, may I suggest to you Red Black Croxa. Now, this deck won the aforementioned Red Bull Untapped event in France a week or so ago, depending on, I guess, when you're watching this video. But this deck completely took that tournament and actually placed 2 different builds in the top 8. So this is a proven build that a lot of people are talking about within the last week or two, and I think it, again, gets even better now. If Rogues is a good deck, this is almost certainly a good deck, because Rogues fills the graveyard for you so that you can escape your Croxa or the odd Ox of Agonis or whatever you're doing in the deck. This is just a really strong deck that uses Magmatic Chandler to a really good extent, a really good purpose. Although I have found that escaping Croxa while keeping enough spells in the yard to make Magmatic Chandler a 4/4 can be a little bit awkward. There's some weird things about the deck, but all in all, it's a deck that I really enjoyed playing. We just made a deck tech on this, so if you want some extended thoughts, check out the deck tech, but my basic thoughts are that this is a fun deck to play that has a lot of different dimensions. Sometimes it plays like a control deck, sometimes it plays like an aggro deck. It's got the nut draw of like turn 2 removal spell or Mire Trident, and then turn 3 Timurid Calls the Dead, put a Croxa in your yard. Turn 4, Croxa, Escape Croxa. So there's a nut draw too, but for the most part, this deck is just really versatile, and it feels fair. It feels like fair, almost old school Magic. That's one of the things I like about this deck, is that it's, remove that guy, play removal spells, play big dudes, recursive threats and whatnot, win wars of attrition, get them into top deck mode by depriving them of resources, and then just win the game with your big recursive guy, Again, like fair Magic. It feels like playing Standard like 2 or 3 years ago. But it also, again, it feels more like an old school deck too, where you just, one of the first decks I made was like a black-red deck that just plays removal spells and big creatures, and that's kind of how this deck feels too. So I really like playing with this deck, and I like the basic concept behind it too, and it's probably going to be an even better deck now than it has been in the last couple of weeks if Rogues does get a foothold in this meta. So keep this deck in mind. It's a really good one. Moving on from there, though, I think people might begin to, especially in Best of 1, but of course Best of 3 is the format that matters, but in both formats, I think that people might start trying to make Winota a thing again, and there's a bunch of different ways to make this deck. Obviously, you can just make the Boros Warriors deck, but that's a little bit awkward. You got Kargan Intimidator and Seasoned Hallowblade in the deck. They're both 2-drop warriors that are humans, so they don't really proc Winota. That's a little weird. There's the Winota Dogs deck, which I think is probably the best Winota deck in the format. But there's still various Mardu Winota decks. There's the Mardu Party deck that plays Winota. So there's a bunch of different ways to build this thing. And I think that people are going to experiment with them, and I would very likely say that Mardu Dogs or red, Boros Dogs would very likely win this battle for best Winota deck, especially considering it also plays Embercleave very well. So, best Embercleave deck wins. Best Winota deck could win too. Why don't you just smash them together? So, I think that you'll probably see more people trying this deck. I've never been a huge fan of Winota. Honestly, I think it's a really powerful card, but you have to draw it on turn 4. It has to hit the table, and it has to survive until the attack step. And you can't, especially in today's Standard, and especially in a world full of rogues where they play counterspells and Heartless Acts and stuff, you just can't really guarantee that Winota is going to be a good card, even if you do draw it and you're able to play it on curve. Got to drop all 4 lands, too. I mean, you have to hit your land drops to play it. There's just a lot of things that can go wrong with Winota. Much less the fact that you might not even draw the card by turn 4 in the first place. So there are some issues with Winota decks, but I do think people will try the deck again, almost certainly. But there are some aggro decks that exist in this format that don't even get to play Embercleave that I think might be worth taking a look at. It may be worth playing. First of all, the mono green Stompy deck is apparently gas. It also plays very well. I think it placed in the top 8. Yeah, it was like 4th place at the Red Bull Untapped qualifier, which isn't like the beginning and end of events this season, but it's the one I keep deferring to because it's one of the more recent events that we've seen. And placing well in that event, good deal. And now that Omnath and Adventure decks are out of the format, I could see Stompy being a much better deck. They don't have Lucky Clovers plus Bone Crusher Giants to take out your biggest creatures. They don't have Lucky Clover plus Brazen Borrower to take out 3 of your dudes at the same time, reset your board state. So I think a deck probably like this probably gets a lot better in the upcoming format. Stompy has undergone some evolution in the last couple of weeks. People are cutting Questing Beast and effectively making the curve stop at 3, save for a Planeswalker or 2. And it's just a really fast, tight deck, and if mono red gets good, mono green could actually come up against it in the format pretty well because, usually these kind of mid-rangey but still fast aggro decks will beat the more low-to-the-ground aggro decks. But again, a tool like Embercleave can even up that score pretty quickly, so I don't know how much confidence I have in that statement, but typically mono green has been very good against mono red throughout Magic's past, so you just get to play bigger creatures than them. You invalidate like everything they do on curve, so there is that, but I'm not sure how good of that advice is in the current format. That said, mono green does have a whole lot of really good tools at its disposal, and it has for a while now. One of the more powerful decks last season, obviously. So I wouldn't be surprised if it saw a resurgence at this point. But the other aggro deck that doesn't play Cleave that I think might actually be pretty good, Mono White Life Gain. Little joke there, sorry. I don't actually believe in Mono White Life Gain, but I do believe in the... Sorry, everybody. I'm probably going to get dislikes on that. Maybe if Mono Red Aggro is good, Mono White Life Gain is good. We'll see. But that one has to be proven. I guess all of these do, but still. The one that I have more faith in myself is Mono White Aggro. that plays Seasoned Hallow Blades and, sometimes All Seeds of Life's Bounty, Selfless Saviors in the 1-drop slot and whatnot. But it also plays Maul of the Skyclaves in the 3-drop slot. Usually looks to suit up a Seasoned Hallow Blade or something and just start going to town. This deck has actually posted pretty good results lately, and it's just a nice little deck, y'all. Streamlined, doesn't have to play a whole bunch of lands. It's got neat little tricks like Kabira Takedown and Shepherd of the Flock. Shepherd of the Flock's Adventure Half will let you return the land part of Kabira Takedown to your hand so you can cast Takedown. There's some really neat tricks in this deck, and Maul of the Skyclaves has proven to be possibly the second best equipment in Standard, and I'm totally serious. There's a big chasm between it and Embercleave, but hey, second to Embercleave is still a pretty good card, right? So I actually like Maul more than a lot of players do, and Seasoned Hallowed Blade is actually maybe the best white creature in Standard. So definitely take mono white aggro more seriously than you're probably taking it. It can take people by surprise. Good deck. But moving on here, something that I really like moving forward is the Lurrus decks. And these decks can play Lurrus in the main deck. They can play it as their companion. I'm not sure what they end up doing, but one way or the other, I like all the different Lurrus builds. Now, obviously, if you know the channel, you know that I really, really like Hateful Eidolon Lurrus builds with enchantments like Deadweight, and what is it, Mire's Grasp? I don't know why I blanked there for a second. But just all the auras that give a creature minus something. Pretty good with Lurrus and Hateful Eidolon, but there's also the All That Glitters builds that are usually Orzhov, so they can play Hateful Eidolon, but sometimes they'll be green-white with Lurrus. But, the All That Glitters builds are pretty decent too, and then there's the probably more popular at this point in time, Lurrus Sacrifice builds that play Archfiend's Vessel. So there's just a whole lot of different Lurrus stuff that you could be doing right now. And I like kind of all of it, especially against rogues and control decks. Any sort of, recursive piece like Lurrus is going to be pretty decent. So I like the idea of exploring what Lurrus can do again in this format. Matter of fact, the creature with a huge target on its back that Lurrus could reanimate if you wanted to is Ruin Crab. We tried this on stream the other night. It didn't work super well, but either way, Ruin Crab is actually one of my favorite cards in Standard right now. I know it's a lot of people's least favorite card in Standard, especially if you play Limited. You probably really don't you're probably very sick of Crab, but still, I've loved every Ruin Crab deck that I've tried, even the bad ones so far. This is just easily one of my favorite cards to brew around, because I'm a bad person, I guess. Am I bad? Am I selfish? I think I might be a terrible dude. But either way, I'm that guy that likes Ruin Crab, and maybe you are too, so it might be time to crack out Ruin Crab and see if this is actually kind of good. As a matter of fact, I've seen some rogues decks that play 4 copies of Ruin Crab. That's the kind of spice I could get behind. But whether it's in a deck we already know exists, like rogues, or a whole new deck like Mono Blue or Demir Mill pops up, then it's probably gonna... It could feature the Krabby Boy, and I'm into that because I love Ruin Crab, and I probably shouldn't apologize for it. I love Ruin Crab. I like it. It's a good card. Now, another deck that I'm really interested in. There's more. There's what are they, 5 or 6 more? There's still decks. But another deck that I'm really interested in and actually spent a good bit of yesterday playing is Selesnya Counters. And then earlier today, Saffron Olive came out on Twitter and was like, guys, Selesnya Counters, low-key pretty good. That's good company to be in when Seth agrees, I think. But anyway, I think Selesnya Counters is actually a really sweet deck right now that I really enjoyed playing yesterday. If you go first, you get the right start. There are just ridiculous things you can do by turn 3 in this deck, but especially by turn 4, it's like you don't even need Embercleave. You swing for 20 with 3 guys very easily in this deck. A lot of the different starts, may produce different results, but they still end up in 20 damage really early in the game, usually from some huge dudes. So I like a lot of what this deck can do. It seems a little bit linear, but with almost any start, it can end up putting together a huge board state very early in the game, even without, Loxodon. That card rotated, but turns out it didn't need that. New stuff like Swarm Shambler, really, really good in this deck. Luminarch Aspirant, too. So picked up a few pieces that make it a viable contender, especially now that some of the more broken decks in the format or no more. So try out Selesnya Counters if you haven't done it yet. I'm not saying this becomes a tier 1 deck or anything, but it just felt really good to play for me yesterday. And I want you to, give it a shot. It's not near as good on the draw, nowhere near, but still. On the play, there are some really cool things you can do very early in the game that make you feel great. But rounding the corner here, another deck that people are almost certainly going to try. I don't know how I feel about it, but people are going to try. Doom Foretold again, because every time there's a meta shakeup, people say Doom Foretold's a deck again. It never is. But it could be this time, right? I mean, we're slowly getting rid of all the best cards from the last few sets. So at some point, it stands to reason that Doom Foretold's going to be a good card. We might have to ban literally every other rare and mythic in the format. But eventually, Doom Foretold, it stands to reason, will be a good Magic card. And at this point in time, it might finally be time for the Doom to be foretold. It has been foretold. We don't know when it's actually going to happen, but at some point the Doom that has been foretold will occur. So maybe it's now, possibly. Just keep an eye on this card. Another thing to keep an eye on is it spells, by the way. A deck that, again, this one keeps popping up at the beginning of the meta the last couple of seasons, and it quickly dies out, but I don't think because it's a bad deck. I think people just kind of lose interest in it. They decide to drop it for quote-unquote more powerful decks, but I don't think this deck has been proven to be bad ever in like the last 2 or 3 seasons, and it keeps picking up pieces. It got Stormwing, Entity, and Core set, but it's gotten a few things in this set, like Magmatic Chandler, which isn't just for the Croxa decks, it's also really good in the Izzet decks, but if you wanted, you could also play Seagate Stormcaller in here, so picked up a few, not just threats, there's good pieces overall, and some cool spells too. Now it can play stuff like Lava Spike Hazard or whatever it is, the really good one. The 1 mana, deal a damage to a whatever target, and then it exiles. Very, very good in Izzet spells. So it got some actual spells too. Just a really solid deck that actually is more versatile than it appears on paper if you haven't played it yet. This deck can do some really cool stuff. It has a lot of awesome starts that lead to big, bursts of damage on like turn 3 or 4. So I think this deck might actually have a chance even in like a Heartless Act, Blood Chief's Thirst format, which is probably what's keeping it down. But, I guess stuff like Stormwing Entity it mostly beats Blood Chief's Thirst. So there's some good arguments for this deck, and I don't think it's a bad one in this meta right now. But anyway, final deck, I think, of this video. Let me just look at my list. Yeah, I think I've talked about everything else. I'm sure there's decks you'll mention in the comments section. If I didn't bring anything up in this video, make sure to let me know, because there's definitely good decks in Standard. I didn't say Big Red. Maybe I should have said Big Red, but it's not in this video. I'm sure people will try to make it work. Maybe, Ironcrack Feet into Ugin on turn 5 is the best way to play Ugin now. Who knows? But anyway, I guess that's there. Big Red. Play Big Red. Yeah. Anyway, last deck I want to bring up, though, is Orzhov Clerics. Long shot, I know, but it's not a bad deck. It's really not. It's a fair Magic deck like some of the other decks on this list, but it's recursive in a number of ways. It plays Agadeem's Awakening. It often plays Null Priest of Oblivion. It can play Call the Death Dweller if it wants. And obviously it plays Aura, which is like the most recursive element in the deck. So it's got a lot going for it in the recursibility department, the annoying control decks and rogues decks department. So there is that. And, once it establishes the board state that it wants, it gets a whole lot of synergy, snowballs really well with, like, Luminarch Aspirant and Cleric of Lifespawn. So there's a lot of really cool stuff. Taborax is maybe the best card in the deck, and also lends this sort of snowbally feel. If you get the right board state for more than 2 turns, you just get this huge board state as a result. And Taborax draws a bunch of cards. A really good deck in feel, in theory, but again, we're in a format where Heartless Act, Blood Chief's Thirst are played in a whole lot of decks. Bone Crusher Giant is played in a whole lot of decks. And these are cards that invalidate what you're trying to do some of the time. And, cards like Taborax and Aura might just get countered. Agadeem's Awakening might just get countered. So it is kind of still a little bit hostile, I feel, to a deck like Clerics. But Clerics might have a really good matchup against Mono Red, considering, again, it gains a lot of life. So it kind of depends on how the meta shakes out. But I still think Clerics is a deck that Wizards gave us a whole lot of really good pieces for. And I want to explore it in this meta and see exactly how good or bad the deck is. Again, not a whole lot of faith. That's why it's all the way at the end of the video. But I think Clerics is at least worth looking at with the pieces that we're given right now. It was one of my favorite decks to test of all the decks that I've tested for Deck Techs so far this season. So, Clerics. But anyway, I think that's it. Is there anything else? Mono... Blue, no. I can't think of anything right now. I mean, you could always try Adventures. Ali Warfield said that Green-Black Adventures is still gas. Temur Adventures might still be a good deck without Lucky Clover. I mean, it still gets to play good cards. Turns out decks that play good Magic cards are typically quite good. So, you can still play it. It just won't be near as broken. You won't be able to cast Brazen Borrower and get rid of my entire board. Thank God, Brazen Borrower. Still going to be annoying. Brazen Bar will still get magic cards. Same thing with Bone Crusher, but it won't be anywhere near as good now. And that's, oh. I might be happier about the Lucky Clover ban than I am about the Omnath ban. I'm serious. I might be. That needed to go, and it did, and I'm happy about that. But anyway, that's the video, right? If you liked it, hit the like button. That seems fairly simple. Doesn't really take you much time, costs you nothing, helps me out within the algorithm. So do that if you want more people to see the video. Or you just keep it secret tech, but don't do that. Spread the word, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you want more stuff like this. Obviously, we got a bunch of deck techs to do now, don't we, boys? And like 2 days from now, I'm going to put out the top 10 cards to brew with, which will be pretty much completely different from this list. So that one's going to be a lot spicier. So make sure you're subbed for that content. Hit the bell for the notifications. If you want to, you can help determine what content we do around here by voting on it over at Patreon. It's patreon.com/SBMTG, link in the description. And yeah, make sure to take to the comments section. Let me know how you felt about not only the decks I talked about, but anything I didn't talk about. Make sure you let us know the spice down there. If you, I think I covered most of the decks you can play. So if there's anything that I didn't mention, give us the secret stuff down there in the sideboard area. But anyway, I guess I'm done for now. Yeah. Now it's your turn. Let me know how you felt about it. And I am going to get to brewing, which is all I've been doing the last couple of days. It's been a good time to be a Magic player, which we don't get to say enough lately, or I guess not enough people say lately. But, hot take. I like Magic. I still like Magic. I really do. It's maybe the best game that's ever been invented of all time. And I think some people are really giving Wizards a lot of flack, which is totally acceptable. You should give Wizards flack. They do some things wrong. But, I've seen a lot of people complaining about this ban because it didn't come fast enough. They didn't go hard enough on it. But I was one of those people that thought they would never ban Omnath ever, that they would never do that, especially while the set was still selling boosters. There's just no way, right? But they did it. I give them credit for that. They didn't chicken out. They actually did the right thing, what needed to be done. And I was not ready to give them credit for doing that. I just didn't think they would. So here I am. They've proven me and a bunch of other people wrong, because I think a lot of us didn't think this would happen. So I give them credit for that. They did it. I'm happy about it. Now let's get to brewing. I'll satch you cats. What is satch? Satch should be a verb. I play a lot of Scrabble now. Scrabble is my newest other addiction. And I marvel at how many words aren't words. You know what I mean? So let's make satch a word. It probably should look it up. It probably already is. But anyway, I'll catch you cats later. I'm dead from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Take it easy, spread love, and be kind.